Hi everyone, welcome. I'm down here in my wormery, and the bin that you see out here has a piece of paper, a green piece of paper, somewhere around here, similar to this piece of cardboard, punched full of holes. And the reason I punch it full of holes is to allow worms to pass through. So it was 10 days ago that we set up that green piece of paper as the partition divider in between what we now consider to be the finished castings in this bin and what I had set up 10 days ago as their horizontal migration feeding zone. It's just a section of the bin intended to lure the worms over out of their finished castings so that at some point in the near future we can scoop them out, get them relocated, and harvest their castings. And this is kind of an interesting batch of worms. 10 days ago, prior to them getting set up this way, their previous assignment had been participating in a time lapse of a pumpkin being consumed by them over the course of, I'm trying to remember now, it was 5 weeks, I believe. And right after we concluded that time-lapse filming, we took them and we set them up the way you see them here today. We went straight from time-lapse filming to horizontal migration. And after 10 days, I would have to assume that these worms are probably heavily motivated and probably, for the most part, already living over in their horizontal migration feeding zone. But I really don't know. So I kind of anticipated that we would sort of be doing a reset here today. And that's the reason, besides coming down here with the replacement for the green paper, I also came down with some replenishment food. And it seemed to me like, perhaps we could also take a little time to sort of stir up the castings and possibly assist in seeing the material dry off a little bit, and maybe even return that pink plastic covering that was on here in such a way that it would allow for some of the moisture in the system to start escaping a little bit. Because there's, ways to get the worms to move, and one of them is to try to lure them, but a lot of times perhaps the more effective way is to repel them, and repelling them is very often done most effectively by creating a dry environment that they don't want to be in, kind of causing them to begin moving and trying to find themselves a more comfortable place to be. So I thought that, I bet you this is probably all that's left of this horizontal migration feeding zones partition divider. So I'm curious, why don't we see what we could do about pulling back some of this finished castings material, and I guess part of that would also be just pulling back worms into the castings, despite the fact that we are attempting to migrate them out of their castings. The end goal is to have castings that are free of any worms, but I'd also at the same time like to end up with castings that are free of any debris, and that's the reason I like putting that little partition divider out there, to try to keep all this shredded paper and stuff that I build their horizontal migration zone with out of the finished castings, to keep the castings nice and clean. So what I'm doing here is also kind of in line with what I was hoping to do here today anyway, which was to sort of till the material up and aerate it a bit. And I don't have any intention today of actually hauling worms out. After 10 days, I would have to guess that the migration zone is probably pretty highly populated with worms, and we probably, if we wanted to, could do an extraction of worms out of this material. And I do also have a couple new bins that I've built for these little guys in anticipation of them needing a new home at some point soon. But I really didn't intend to do that today. My only aim today was to come back in here to make sure that the feeding zone is well stocked with food, so that any worms that do come over to hang out in the feeding zone remain there. And I've got some of my bedding on standby with which we can also build out the feeding zone a little bit. And then I guess between aerating and possibly leaving the plastic covering off the finished castings, perhaps we'll also start increasing the motivation of the worms to try to come over and try to all gather in the feeding zone. And I guess crowding in the feeding zone is also a consideration, I think. So I do believe that at some point we will need to do a haul out and then do a reset and allow the process to continue, because I'm not sure all the worms in this system will fit into just this tiny edge of the bin. So I can imagine us doing multiple haul outs of this until such a point in time in the future when we can consider this material truly depopulated. At 350 days of age, we're only 2 weeks and 1 day away from this system reaching a year old. And I'm not averse to the idea of it exceeding that, but it would kind of be nice to think that in 2 weeks, or 2 weeks from now, prior to this thing hitting 365 days of age, it would be nice to see all the worms out and have the castings pretty much ready for use and free of worms. Although at that point I often do hang on to castings like that and allow time for any cocoons that the worms might have left behind to be to hatch, basically, for the cocoons to go full term and allow the little babies within the cocoons to emerge, and then work on rounding them up before putting the castings to actual use out in the garden or whatever. So I'm just a little bit cramped for space here, as you might be able to tell. That's the reason I'm taking so much time here. But I believe we've got a pretty decent separation here, and I don't see any signs of that green paper down below. And I would have to imagine that any worms coming over to visit the horizontal migration feeding zone probably took a nice little bite out of that green paper along the way. And it didn't really serve much of a purpose in the end in terms of keeping these two separate. A lot of times when I use a piece of cardboard, it does show heavy signs of wear with worms nibbling away at it. But I can usually rely on it to do its job of, keeping the nice castings free of any of this debris. So now I feel like I've given myself a good workspace here to explore the feeding zone. And the feeding today, or the horizontal migration feeding, if you want to call it that, will give us the opportunity to replace this feeding zone indicator, this coffee filter, because I've got a replacement coffee filter here along with a day's worth of coffee in it. And the stuff that you see alongside of it, you see some carrot peels. Those are both white carrots, and the white carrots are parsnips, I believe, as well as just traditional yellow, orange carrots. And these larger chunks here are knob celery. Came out of a soup. The knob celery, I guess you can chop it up and include it as some of the veggies that are part of your soup and eat them, but I guess the main job of that stuff is to inject the soup with some delicious flavor. And if you got tons of carrots and everything else, then it might just be overkill. So extracting the knob celery after the soup has been prepared is sometimes an option too. So let's dig in. I'm curious to see how these worms are coming along over here in the feeding zone. The stuff we used last time to try to motivate the worms to come over, besides all this shredded paper and cardboard and leaves, was melon. No, not melon. What was it? Pumpkin. Pumpkin and Brussels sprouts leaves. Man, we got a lot of worms coming together over here. I guess I've got other chunks of bedding type materials scattered in here, sort of the way we did with that coffee filter. I just figured I would try to fragment this into somewhat smaller bits as long as we're over here. And if a couple worms escape from this little gathering here and make their way back into the finished castings, it's not the end of the world, because we're not extracting worms today. We're just resetting, replenishing the food, replenishing the bedding. But you got to admit, we've definitely got a good turnout here. Wow, look at all these worms in here. They came out in great numbers, and I don't see any signs of leftovers of that pumpkin, and I didn't expect to either. So I'm not too surprised. I just thought that if we were to bump into any other large chunks of paper, that we can maybe shred them up a little bit too. Oh man, look at all the worms in here. Man, we could certainly do a haul out if we wanted to today. Sometimes I feel like I should prepare myself for multiple eventualities. Instead of predestining my game plan by saying, no, I'm not going to do a haul out, I should maybe come in here prepared to do one instead of telling myself no right from the beginning. Because look at all these worms. They're doing so good in here. They look quite happy to be mobbed together, but I don't want them to feel crowded, so I think I will pile in some fresh bedding, and then we'll put in the additional food for them. And then hopefully by expanding the space, they won't feel overly crowded. Although if they do feel a little crowded, I wouldn't be too surprised, because there is a crowd of worms in here, that's for sure. Look at them all. Wow. Gotta have at least a pound of worms piled in here, maybe more. Not to mention all the other worms that are still hanging out in the finished castings on the other side of the partition. That is something else. So yeah, you know, I'm almost thinking the position where this little partition has been placed might even be a good place for it to remain, so that we can significantly increase the real estate for these little guys to move over into, so that that sense of them being crowded doesn't occur. So why don't we grab a little bit of my prepared bedding here. This is I've got a couple more buckets of dry, prepared, shredded paper cardboard that came out of my shredder before it died, but I'm now kind of working down the last of my supply of prepared bedding here. And the 2 bins that I created, into which I plan to move these worms at some point, because I do want to split this population into 2 separate bins. The paper that I used to build those containers was all shredded by hand. So I took at least an hour yesterday to take a number of these leaf collection bags and shred them up into little itsy bitsy pieces, along with some leaves from outside, to create a nice spacious environment for them, but perhaps not quite as spacious as I had hoped, since, you know, shredding paper is a little bit of a drag. It takes time to end up with perhaps not as much as you had hoped to end up with. So let's see, the knob celery chunks are cooked and now frozen, and then these 2 pieces of pumpkin are going in frozen. The frozen stuff is attaching itself to the somewhat damp coffee. So I'm just trying to carefully extract it so that that coffee filter can remain intact. I guess we can also just use this piece of paper towel as supplemental bedding down here too. And then this way we're sort of shielding any worms that might end up stacked on top of this from the cold stuff down below. We'll also be piling in this coffee too, which is at room temperature, so I don't freeze the coffee. So we'll have ourselves a little insulation layer here for when we backfill the newly added bedding and food. I think we can even add maybe a little bit more shredded paper cardboard leaf mixture over the top of the food as well, to kind of help build this out further. But then I will bring back a lot of this partially worked stuff too to cover up with and level off. We'll put a little bit of my worm chow in here too, and let's top off with just perhaps another handful of this stuff right here. I'll tell you, this is a really nice batch of worms coming together here. Every now and then I'm a little bit skeptical of just how many worms occupy my systems, but sometimes you could really see them clear as day, as we saw here today. So let's just use some of this stuff here to cover back up, so we've got some somewhat worked material for the worms to come over and explore, and then as they see fit to do so, they could dive down into the newly added bedding and food supply. And then what we have here is a pretty good horizontal migration feeding zone. I do kind of like to have the horizontal migration feeding zone and the finished castings sort of at the same level if possible, but it's not terribly important. So let's see what we look like when we start to backfill here. I guess the other thing that I had hoped to do here, which is to sort of aerate the finished castings and sort of just check it out in general, is going to be tricky. just because of the limited amount of space I have to work in here. So just thinking maybe we can do a little bit, but I gotta be careful. I guess here too I'm just trying to see what I could do about keeping the finished castings on its own side of the partition. Let's just see what we could do in terms of just maybe bringing a little bit of the stuff from the bottom up to the surface. Perhaps crumbling it a little bit and aerating it a bit. And here and there I'm definitely bumping into little hard chunks that are getting rehydrated slowly, but they're probably the stuff that was sort of spread out across the top when the system was still in time-lapse mode. Because when it was in time-lapse mode, the top surface over the course of those 5+ weeks was unprotected from evaporation, so a lot of its moisture was lost to evaporation. But it was kind of nice when we finally tilled up all the material to see how things were, to find that the material right below the dry top surface was quite damp and loaded with worms, and everybody seemed happy. I just feel like when I bump into one of these little hard boulders that I want to try to break it apart, which I could not have done 10 days ago when we were in here last, because it was just, I mean, those things are like little rocks. They're just so tough. So just that gradual rehydration softens them up enough to be broken apart. But since they are pretty much all castings anyway, it doesn't matter. It just seems like you would want this stuff to flow a little bit better, and just in case there's anything else sort of trapped within any one of those little boulders, that it would also have a chance to get broken down if there's any lingering bits of food or bedding trapped in one of those boulders, giving the worms that are still over here a chance to nibble that down too before they head over into the feeding area and collection area. So I'm starting to think that by the time we get in here next time, whenever that may be, we will probably be doing a haul out of worms and a launch of a new systems with some of these African night crawlers. And then, you know, let me just kind of swing around to the side here just so I can get my arm into a position that is a little bit more friendly to doing a good effective scoop down to the bottom. I know I haven't really tilled up the entire contents of the finished castings here, and I know that when I reach down to the bottom I find some stuff that's a little bit packed together, but it certainly isn't bad. So it doesn't feel like doing it everywhere is crucial. So just by doing a few spot checks like that, it does seem like things are in great shape here. So I don't know, what do you guys think? This thing seems to like doing good. How much longer do you think it'll take for these worms to exit this material? And I guess just to help you in giving me that answer with the proper knowledge, I think we are going to return the plastic covering in such a way that it definitely protects our feeding area from losing its moisture content to evaporation. So the plastic covering will definitely go over what's going on over here, but I think we'll leave it more or less uncovered on this side. So we'll still provide the system with a little bit of covering so it's not completely exposed. So I thought maybe we can spread this piece of paper out a little bit in such a way that it would be covering in those places where we're now not going to be covering with plastic any longer. Just because it's not important to me that it gets super dry super quick. I just thought that helping it dry a little bit would be beneficial and good motivation to get the worms to begin cruising over towards the collection area in the horizontal migration feeding zone. And then we'll, you know, even leave this edge of it somewhat covered with plastic too, but the rest of it will be left to begin drying off a little bit gradually, so we can return this in such a way so that it definitely provides maximum coverage for the feeding area, which is what we're definitely interested in having. But over in the finished casting side, we can now begin to promote a little bit of drying. And in the very beginning, when we first set this up 10 days ago, after it had been sitting out in time-lapse mode and everything was so dry, I really did want to have thorough plastic coverings to allow the whole thing to sort of rehydrate everywhere, and it seems like that has happened nicely out here. But I do feel like it is time to allow this stuff to begin drying a little bit, to motivate the worms to seek out the nice oasis we set up for them on the edge of the bin, and that'll help us drive towards the goal of rounding the worms up and getting them into a single spot to get them to a place where we can easily haul them out. So, I don't know, sometimes I like to sort of put something like this out here as a cover so that the worms feel comfortable hanging out on the surface and not put off by any light that might be going through this translucent plastic. So I think I'll just protect the feeding zone from light to make it nice and dark and cozy for them over there. And if any of this stuff over on this side is too bright for them and they don't like it, then they know where to go. Go to the dark side. Alright everyone, that's it for our check-in with our African night crawlers on day 350, 10 days into their horizontal migration, with a second feeding now applied into the horizontal migration feeding zone, and I think we're going to be set for a haul out next time. So next time should be fun, getting worms out of here and launching a new bin. So I don't know, we'll probably wait another 10 or so days to make that happen. So until then, let's say goodbye to the African night crawlers. We'll see them in a short while, in a few days, 10 days maybe or so, depending on how the schedule fits. But other than that, we're done here. So let me get things cleaned up and put away, but I'm not going to waste your time with that. Before I go really quick, let me just say thank you. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always very much appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's really appreciated as well. Oh yeah, by the way, yesterday when I took this thing back up to the kitchen, I left it on the stove. And the stove I had left on by accident after making myself some food. And I kind of destroyed this poor little dollar store plastic container. Luckily they're inexpensive and I've got another one upstairs. But I figured if as long as I could keep using it for this, then what the heck, why not, right? Alright everyone, thanks again for watching. Bye now.